The survivors from Dead by Daylight. From what we know, they were people of different ages, backgrounds, that just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, cruelly dragged from their lives, whether they be good or bad, and forced into the realm of the entity where they face endless torture. But maybe it's not that easy. Maybe it's not that convenient. As we know, the entity manipulates and twists the killers before it drags them in, impulsing them and vibing in their heads. But maybe, just maybe, the survivors have had a similar treatment. As we've seen from a recent archives, maybe the survivors and the killers are united in one aspect, that the entity has cruelly plucked them from their place and has always had an eye on them. So let's delve in to the archives and let's delve into the speculation and just see, for instance, how the survivors interacted with the entity. We know for the most part the entity primarily takes no sides. It doesn't seem to care as long as it could feast off the hope. However, its primary way of feasting is with hooks. So, usually, it helps out the killers more than the survivors. Now, there are various different ways and methods it could do this. The entity blockers. Whether it be from a survivor overindulging in vaults or bamboozle. The perk. Corrupt intervention. And thrilling tremors will lock off the gens for survivors. You also have things like cruel limits, which too lock off the vaults. Then you have things that the survivors can incorporate. Perks like repressed alliance, used to shut off generators, preventing the killer from doing any damage. Honestly, the entity seems to be indwelled its lives in both survivors and killers. It's also hinted towards that the entity is what imbues both survivors and killers with their aura reading capabilities. So, what bodes the question is, are the survivors chosen just like the killers? As we've seen with Frank Morrison and Rin's father, the entity has possessed and influenced the killers in order to get to their path they wanted. But as we've seen with Kate, being almost taken or at least interacted with in the cave, we know that the entity sets its sights out for the survivors, maybe even earlier than when they were taken. Kate's lore from the archives also describes that she's felt feelings like this before. She knows this situation but just can't exactly pinpoint it, which would definitely hint towards the fact that this is not the first time the entity has met Kate. This is not the first time Kate has probably gone in this area. As we know, the dark melody that she plays was influenced by the entity. So, it's safe to assume that they have encountered each other multiple times before it finally grasped her up. What of the other survivors in question? How many times has the other survivors been encountered and plucked and lost their memory of these scenarios? Min wandering the bars, looking for a place to forget her esports failures, waking up in places she didn't remember. How many times was that due to a drunken stupor, or maybe due to a run-in with Claude, a Baldridge abomination? If the entity can manipulate Kate into playing a song, a dark melody, and if it can implement and influence Frank into doing cruel acts of stabbing the janitor and twist Rin's father into becoming a crazed maniac, then it's safe to assume that the entity's influence stretches out from both survivor and killer, corrupting them and pulling them to do actions that the entity wants. Maybe it twists the survivors. Maybe the survivors aren't randomly chosen by happen chance. Maybe the entity had its eyes set on them for special qualities they may have, their determination, their obsession, their brutality. All these could be qualities that the entity uses, the entity desires, and the survivors fit the bill. So the entity stalks them, manipulates them, and drags them to the right area for it to snatch them away. We know from their aura reading and from their own interactions with the entity, whether it be benefiting the survivors with repressed alliance or the killers with the various perks where the entity will step in, cruel limits, thrilling tremors and corrupt intervention, bamboozle, and spirit fury. Each and all the entity plays parts in these people's lives, major parts and lesser parts, and it seems that the entity has played parts outside of their lives indeed. So, will we see more examples in later archives of the entity manipulating survivors? Or was Kate just a unique case? Was Kate's need to connect with those around her what made the entity attack her? What made the entity go after her multiple times for its eventual kidnapping? Or was this a universal thing? Has Min, Ace, Claudette, and the other survivors encountered the entity in their lives? And will we find out about those interesting developments? If we do, I'll be here to report on them and dive more into the fog that we hold. Thank you guys for listening. This is kind of a vague idea that came along the lines of writing Kate's lore files. So it would be interesting to see if we could end up delving more into this with more cosmetics and survivors. I'll definitely enjoy doing a re-dive into this if we do get any interesting bits of information. As of now, I'd like to state that I'm back on track with doing my lore files. Typically, some will be revolving around other games, but mainly I'm trying to lock down the ones to do with the archives. So that means look forward to Doctor, Jane, David, Spirit has already been done. So what's next is Huntress, Legion, Dwight, and Kate. Also, with the next lore archives coming out, we also have to look forward to Wraith, Meg, Hag, and Ace. Hopefully their archives will be good. Hopefully I'll have a lot more to delve into in the fog. Goodbye guys, and thank you for watching. I've been Volfa, and I'll bid you adieu.